Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Mullins, and I'm District Judge in Letcher County, Kentucky. I'm going to introduce to you the final presentation of the evening by Dr. Stephen Lloyd. Many of us have read the book Dope Sick or have watched the Hulu miniseries by the same name, which accurately depicts the first wave of the opioid epidemic, which struck Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley and subsequently swept the nation, which resulted from the release of OxyContin in 1996 and the deaths that followed thereafter. For those of you who have watched the Hulu miniseries, Michael Keaton's character, Dr. Samuel Phoenix, is based in part on the life of Dr. Stephen Lloyd, who consulted and worked extensively with the show's producers. However, unlike Dr. Phoenix's character in the Dope Sick miniseries, we know how Dr. Lloyd's battle with addiction played out. It was a victory for himself and for countless other people along the way. I will briefly go over the highlights of Dr. Lloyd's personal life and his professional career. Dr. Stephen Lloyd was raised and grew up on a small farm in East Tennessee from a family of mostly mechanics. Unfortunately, Stephen was never very good with a screwdriver or wrench and became the first in his family to enroll and complete college. During his undergraduate days, Stephen developed a problem with drinking, wherein the only way that he could quit was to either run out or to pass out. He had a history of childhood trauma. After completing his undergraduate, Stephen was able to gain control over his problem with drinking and entered East Tennessee State Medical School in Johnson City, Tennessee. During his time in medical school, Stephen excelled, being named class president all 4 years. He received various awards during his internships and ultimately became the chief resident during his final year of training. During this final year of residency, Dr. Lloyd began feeling the pressure and stress of this position, along with having a family, a wife, and 2 small children. One day, while driving home from the hospital, he decided to take a hydrocodone pill that was prescribed to him months earlier after some dental work he had received. Dr. Lloyd thought, why not take this medicine? A number of his patients were on it and seemed to be having some positive results. Dr. Lloyd noted after taking this pill that his stress seemed to melt away and it became easier to manage the stress of his professional life as being a resident and ultimately then in private practice as a doctor, along with that of being a husband and father. Dr. Lloyd's decision to take this first hydrocodone pill proved very disastrous considering his family history and his early childhood trauma. Dr. Lloyd maintained a successful private practice for 3 to 4 years, even despite becoming addicted to opioids. However, this impact of his addiction did start to take a toll on his personal and family life. At the height of his addiction, Dr. Lloyd was taking 500 milligrams of OxyContin per day, along with as many as 100 other pain pills on a daily basis. Dr. Lloyd was taking enough Tylenol contained in these pain pills to overdose simply on the Tylenol, let alone the other hydrocodone and oxycodone that were contained in these tablets. In 2004, his father accidentally observed him taking a handful of Percocet 10s. His father confronted him about the problem and ultimately convinced him to receive treatment. His father drove him to treatment for the Center for Professional Excellence in Nashville, Tennessee, which at that time was primarily a treatment facility used by those in the medical profession. Upon entry to the Center for Professional Excellence, it was obvious to the staff there the extent of Dr. Lloyd's problem, and he was immediately referred to Vanderbilt Hospital for a 5.5-day detox program, which was pretty common at the time. When he entered Vanderbilt Hospital, Dr. Lloyd was placed in a unit with 23 other people suffering from substance abuse disorders, primarily that of being prescription pain pills or heroin. Dr. Lloyd recalls that the majority of people who were in detox with him at that time appeared much younger than he did. After completing the detox and then returning to the Center for Professional Excellence for a 3-month stay, Dr. Lloyd returned home to his private practice in Johnson City with a lot of support, safeguards, and regular attendance at a 12-step program. Just as before he entered treatment, Dr. Lloyd's professional career again soared. He became Chief of Staff for the Veterans Administration Mountain Home in Johnson City, Tennessee, where he oversaw 35 residency programs. At the same time, not using any type of opioids, his personal and family life flourished. However, despite this personal and professional success, Dr. Lloyd seemed troubled by what he had experienced at the Vanderbilt Hospital detox unit, which he believed was a lack of access for treatment. Of the 24 people in the detox unit at that time, he was the only one eligible for additional inpatient treatment due to his status as a doctor. This lack of access for treatment, in my opinion, haunted Dr. Lloyd and drives him to this day. As a result of his haunting and troubling, Dr. Lloyd began gathering and studying as much information that he could find about addiction, dependency, and treatment. Dr. Lloyd became passionate about medically assisted treatment, which he believed could level a playing field and provide access to treatment for everyone and keep users in treatment long enough for their brains to properly heal from the damage of drug use. We now know that access to treatment is the number one variable in recovery. Dr. Lloyd, as part of his research into treatment, dependency, and addiction, was invited to speak to the Tennessee legislature. As a result of his presentation, Dr. Lloyd was offered a job as the medical director and assistant commissioner for the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Service. As medical director and assistant commissioner, Dr. Lloyd oversaw all inpatient and outpatient treatment facilities in Tennessee and was informally referred to as Tennessee's opioid czar. Dr. Lloyd remained in this position for the remaining 2.5 years of Republican Governor Bill Haslam's term. Currently, Dr. Lloyd is an expert witness for the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the DEA, and has provided testimony for Commonwealth attorneys in both Virginia and Kentucky. Locally, Dr. Lloyd was an expert witness for the U.S. Attorney's Office, criminal prosecution of Dr. Charles Gott in Western Kentucky, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecution of Dr. Ace Cheney in Eastern Kentucky. Dr. Lloyd works extensively with Judge Dwayne Sloan in his recovery court in both Jefferson and Sevier County, Tennessee. Currently, Dr. Lloyd has fulfilled his commitment to provide access for medical treatment to all by being medical director at the following facilities who serve underserved populations who receive TennCare or their version of Medicaid. He is medical director at Medical Pure, The Next Door, Cedar Recovery, and New Hope. It is with great pleasure and respect that I introduce to you Dr. Stephen Lloyd.
I'd like to thank Judge Mullins for that kind introduction. You just heard a little bit of my history, and I think the most important thing about me is that I'm actually in recovery myself from opioid and benzodiazepine addiction back earlier in my career. I've been in continuous long-term recovery now since July 8th, 2004. And when I got back from treatment, and I was still a practicing internist in Northeast Tennessee, I was born and raised in a little town called Jonesboro, which is not far from Eastern Kentucky, in the point of Tennessee, in between Eastern Kentucky, Western North Carolina, and Southwest Virginia. And that's where I lived the first 45 years of my life. I now currently live in greater Nashville, Tennessee, and have been here about 6 years. But when I got back from treatment, I went back into the hospital and started working in my normal job. I'm an internist, so I was practicing in the hospital, taking care of heart attacks, strokes, seeing patients in the ICU, the things that that a normal hospital physician does. But in the back of my mind, and really in my life, I didn't want to do anything other than addiction. I was so interested in it. I couldn't believe that I had this thing come into my life that I couldn't control, that I couldn't stop doing, no matter how bad I wanted to. I couldn't believe I'd been to rehab, in all honesty. But I'm very grateful for that today, obviously, and it's given me things I could have never dreamed of. So when I got back, I was actually practicing for about 5 or 6 years, just back as a regular physician. And the whole time I was in the background, I was reading and learning more and more about addiction, and wanted to try to figure out how to get into that field of medicine, because I know what a difference it can make in people's lives. And so I had some friends around who were working in it, and they kind of got me involved in it a little bit. And I started seeing patients, and I started getting all these patients from Eastern Kentucky, in counties that really I'd heard maybe on the news when there was a tornado warning or something like that, but had never been there. I knew it was in coal mining country. I know a little bit about Harlan and places like that, but really, as far as the rest of Eastern Kentucky, really not much. And it seemed like that about every other patient that I got or I was taking care of was from Letcher County, Kentucky. And I didn't know anything at all about Letcher County. I'd never heard of Jenkins, Whitesburg, Neon. I'd never heard of any of those places. But I kept learning more and more about my patients and what they were facing in that area of Kentucky. And so I'd been doing it for about 6 months and met a lot of folks from Eastern Kentucky and really was impressed with how they were doing. Really got to know them on a personal level. You know, when you take somebody's history and you treat them for substance use disorder, you know them really, really well, as you're going to find out in the course of my talk. And so I got really interested in where they were from. And I was from Appalachia, but I was from a different part of Appalachia. And so one Saturday, I told my wife, I said, "Then we don't have anything to do this weekend. What do you say we take a drive up into Eastern Kentucky?" And so we did that. Karen and I loaded up the car and we took off up the road into Eastern Kentucky. And I visited all the towns and small places that I'd never heard of, other than through my patients. And I started to learn and understand a little bit about the culture and history of Eastern Kentucky. And as an extension part of Southern West Virginia and the northern part of Southwest Virginia. And really went on like a 5-year, 5-year education of myself about what that area entailed and what they had faced, and what the hopes of economic prosperity were, and what were the challenges faced by the area, and really continue a lot of that stuff today. And so as I've gone on now, I've done this for coming up on 15 years. And I was the drug czar for the state of Tennessee and really know the state, from end to end, and have gotten fortunate enough to do a lot of things on a national scale. But anytime I'm talking to a group of people that do this on a big scale, like more than just one state, and we're talking about the opioid crisis and the areas that have been decimated. And if they don't mention Eastern Kentucky, I basically write them off, because that's somebody who doesn't really understand what they're talking about. When I think of Eastern Kentucky, I think of a place that is just ungodly beautiful, but at the same time been decimated by the opioid crisis, and continues to be to this day. And so when Judge Mullins reached out to me and I figured out that he was from Whitesburg, Kentucky, my heart leapt, because that's where I got my start in addiction medicine. Was treating people from Eastern Kentucky. Mainly at first, it was opioid dependent pregnant women, but later on, their significant others and their other family members. And Kentucky has done a pretty good job at making evidence-based treatment available. So we don't get as many of those patients anymore in Tennessee, in our Medicaid programs in particular. But that was one of the things that drew me to this project. And so what I'm going to try to do over the next hour, really never tried to do in a talk before, and I've done hundreds of these things, but I'm going to try to give you an overall view of addiction. And I would like for you to, whatever you think about addiction right now, I'd like for you to set it aside for about the next hour. If you could do it, if you could just put it over here, and then after that hour, if you want to pick it back up, you're welcome to. But in the next hour, I'd like for you to consider some things that maybe, take you out of your comfort zone a little bit. I can assure you that they took me out of my comfort zone, because I got into the recovery via the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous in an abstinence-based program for doctors in Tennessee. And I've never used medication of any type. And for the longest time, I was biased against medication and said it was switching one drug for another and all those things that I hear people saying now. And I found that just isn't true whenever you understand what people are up against and really what the core of addiction is. So I'm going to try to cover that. I'm going to try to cover the medications of addiction, opioid addiction, mainly naltrexone, which is injectable, Vivitrol, methadone, and buprenorphine-based agents. Most people recognize the name Suboxone, but it's sold under multiple trade names, and try to show you the role of medication, because I can assure you, whatever your feelings are about medication, they save lives. All three of those medications save lives. They all three have a different niche, but they save lives. They quell cravings, and cravings are why people relapse. And so medication plays an integral role for us now, and will play an even bigger role going forward long-term to help save these young kids' lives. because, if you look at the year ending October of 2021, we lost more than 100,000 Americans to drug overdose, and more than 80% of those were opioid related, mainly illicit heroin and fentanyl. And most of those patients got their start on prescription pain medication. So we're talking about a tremendous number of people. And I'm not a graph guy, and I'm not I'm not one of these guys that's going to have a bunch of slides with, words all over it and read it to you. That's not what I do. But this stat right here gets my attention. And hopefully it'll get your attention like it got mine. If we continue on our current rate of overdose deaths in the United States, by the year 2024, which is less than 2 years away now, we will have lost more Americans to drug overdose than we've lost in every war that the United States has ever fought in, going back to the War of Independence. And I want you to think about that, going back all the way to, the 1770s up through current day. And you got to remember, in the Civil War, where we lost more Americans than we, lost in any other war, because everybody on both sides was an American. Think about how many people that is. We're losing enough Americans right now every day to equal a 747 jet crashing and burning and killing everybody on board every other day. And I dare say, if that was happening, none of us would fly. Yet it goes along under the radar, because the deaths don't happen with a plane going down. They happen in isolation. They happen in little pockets and little small towns and big towns. And people don't want you to know, right? They want to keep what's inside the four walls of their house, inside the walls of their four walls of their house. And so we've got all of these isolated deaths that are going on. We've got this epidemic of opioid abuse and opioid overdose deaths that are gnawing away at the fabric of our families in this country. And I don't think that we're going to get very far until we start talking about it and openly discussing possible solutions. The opposite of addiction is not recovery. The opposite of addiction is community and relationship. And I think that whenever we're able to grasp that, and we can address this as a team in our communities, with the criminal justice system, with our treatment providers, with case managers, with counselors, with people that specialize in helping folks with housing, people that look at extreme abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. I think when we start pulling in the same direction, and we bring prevention efforts into this by identifying these young folks that we know are at risk, then I think we'll start to move the needle, and we'll move the needle as a country. We won't move the needle as long as we're fighting about, oh, you're doing this, so therefore you're not really in recovery, or this doesn't work, or this doesn't work, or these people are only after that. We won't get anywhere with that. And so I want to propose to you that each of us, try to find something in other treatment modalities that's working right. And let's try to spread that, because I think as we do, we'll benefit our patients. So we've got quite kind of an aggressive agenda here. So let's jump in with both feet. So when I start talking about addiction, I want you to understand that addiction is not a moral failure. Most people that look at addiction look at it as there's some kind of moral deficit somebody has inside where they just can't get it. And they can only get recovery if they want it bad enough, if they hurt bad enough, right? Or, quote, they find their bottom, unquote. And in all honesty, I don't believe in any of that at all. I believe in none of that. I've seen plenty of people get into recovery without finding their bottom, me being one of them. I've seen people get into recovery because the court system laid out a program that their essential freedom was going to be dependent upon them going through a process that led them towards recovery from substance use disorder. So I don't believe any of those things. I'm not saying that they don't play a part, but I do not believe those things are absolute. So when we start talking about addiction, I wanted to be able to explain it to people and teach people, no matter if they were at Vanderbilt University in Nashville or if they were in the Rutherford County Jail in Murfreesboro, right? I wanted to be able to teach it across the board. So I really set out on this journey 18 years ago to be able to do this. And so what you're going to see in this part of my talk is what I've come up with, because addiction is this. Addiction is the biopsychosocial model. And those of you who had any kind of psychology training in undergraduate in college, or maybe you have some graduate level training, you recognize that term. If you're doing drug evals or you're doing substance use evals, for patients in the court system or patients in any part of the criminal justice system, then you do something called a BPS. It's a biopsychosocial evaluation. So that's what I'm talking about. So when I hear words like biopsychosocial, I vomit a little bit in the back of my throat, right? That's psychobabble. And so I think of addiction in terms of a slot machine. Okay. And the slot machine premise is pretty simple, right? So the 3 sevens come down on the pay line. And when the 3 sevens come down on the pay line, that's when the money comes out the bottom. Okay. So let's look. First 7. First 7 is the bio part of the biopsychosocial model. And that's simply genetics. 60% of addiction is genetics. It's sperm and egg stuff, right? It's 1 chromosome from mom, 1 from dad. This is DNA base pairs. Those of you that work in the court system, I don't have to tell you this. Okay. When you see somebody coming in your court system, or you see somebody coming in the area of criminal justice that you work in, or any part of the court system with a substance use disorder, and you've been doing this for any length of time, there's a really strong possibility that you know somebody related to them because they've been in there for the same thing. And if you've been around as long as some of us have, you're now treating the kids of the people that you used to try to help a decade ago or 2 decades ago. It's a generational thing. 60% of addiction is genetic. And we can identify who's at risk of developing addiction if we simply know family history. So if you know somebody who's got a family history of addiction, it doesn't mean that they're going to turn out that way, but it means they're at elevated risk. So when we're working in schools and we're working in places to talk about prevention of substance use disorder, the first thing we need to do is assess the genetic risk. Do you have a family member? Do you have a first or second degree relative, mom, dad, brother, sister, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle that has substance use disorder? If you do, the first 7 for you is on the pay line. The second 7 is the psycho part of the biopsychosocial model. And by psycho part, I mean, what kind of household were you raised in? And I don't want any of us to have any illusions here. None of us came out of normal households. They do not exist, right? That's the least attended meeting in the world, is the meeting of people that came out of normal households. They don't exist. Okay. But some of us come out of worse places than others. Some of us come out of places where there's physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Okay. Some of us come out of places like that. And so if we have that kind of history, then we know that elevates our risk for substance use disorder as well. And also, as you think about what these risk factors are, I want you to start thinking about things that would possibly benefit in treatment down the road once the substance use disorder has taken hold and been diagnosed, because we're going to talk about that today as well. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit back to around 1999, 2000. A young doctor named Steve Lloyd in Johnson City, Tennessee, serving as a chief resident at the Veterans Affairs Center there in Johnson City in internal medicine. He's about 6 months away from graduation and going out on his own. On his way home from work one day, he pulls up to a red light in the middle of Johnson City, about 10 minutes away from where he lives. And he's having a pretty rough day, coming off of a really long shift at the hospital, more than 24 hours. I was tired, wasn't really getting along with my wife. Residency was taking its toll on us. I had 2 young kids who were 6 and 3 at the time, and had the pressures of a young dad and leading a young family. I'm getting ready to graduate from residency and step out into a real world job where I'm going to have to take care of patients on my own without anybody signing off beneath me. So I thought I had these life stressors, anxiety, depression. And in my glove box of my truck, and I am a country boy, so I do drive a 4-wheel drive truck, I popped a glove compartment open in my truck that day for some reason. And in there laid some Norcos, hydrocodone/acetaminophen. We all know them as Vicodin. And those Vicodin were given to me by a dentist who had done a procedure on me months before. I didn't think anything about it. I slung them in the glove compartment of my truck, and I didn't care, right? I didn't take any of them. So as I'm sitting there looking at those things with all this stuff going on in my background, I didn't realize that my family history of substance use disorder came into play, because I have a huge family, a huge East Tennessee family. I've had multiple first cousins die secondary to their alcohol or drug use before age 45. So the first 7 is on my pay line. When I was growing up, I was physically and sexually abused, molestation, even rape, physical abuse, and not just spankings. And that was my life growing up. And so I had both sevens sitting here on the pay line. It didn't matter that I had an MD degree hanging on the wall. It didn't matter that I got to be chief resident. It didn't matter that I was getting ready to step into a professorship at East Tennessee State's medical school. None of that stuff mattered. And there, laying in the glove compartment, was a 5 milligram hydrocodone. And I had this conscious thought. I thought, my patients take these things all the time. So I picked that pill up. I broke it in half. That's 2.5 milligrams of hydrocodone. I threw it in my mouth. By the time I got home, suddenly my life was better, right? I wasn't as worried about work. I wasn't as scared about going out on my own as a practicing physician. Suddenly my wife was better than I thought she was. By the way, I'm still married and she's heard this talk, and we have a great life. My kids are grown. At the time, I thought my kids were better behaved, right? Nothing had changed in that 10-minute drive home other than the drug. And what I didn't realize at the time is the part of my brain that's responsible for interpreting pain doesn't differentiate in between physical and emotional pain. That pain that my brain is interpreting in that section of my brain could be because I broke my leg, or it could be because I was having flashback post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms from a childhood trauma. Right? I had no clue that area of the brain didn't differentiate the two. So when I took that pain medication, I could have been treating my broken leg, but there's also a good possibility I'm treating the pain from this chronic trauma of the past. And we see that pathway play out multiple times. How many people in your court system got their start from a medication from some sort of injury, and the injury went away, but the pain medication never did? And I'm telling you, this is the setup for it. So that's the biology, that's the psycho part. All we're waiting on is the social part. And the social part is this: what is widely available and socially acceptable. Okay, so for pain medication, we've known since the time of the Civil War, and even back further than that, the time of Galen and Hippocrates, Greek physician days, back, thousands of years ago, that opioids were dangerous. They have a lot of benefits, but they're horribly addictive, right? And they can lead you right down a pathway of destruction. We've known that for a long time. But in the mid 1980s and early 1990s, the pharmaceutical industry was successful in changing that narrative. Doctors get almost no training on pain control in medical school and residency. They get almost no training on the proper prescribing of controlled substances for acute and chronic pain. And they get almost no training on the recognition of and treatment of people with addictive disease. Now, I think most people would find that appalling, but I assure you it's true. And it's true even today. By the time we're done with this talk today, you guys will know more about addiction and addiction treatment than 95% of the doctors living in your community. And if that's not true, I'll come and wash your car. I'll mow your yard. I promise you it's true. So the pharmaceutical industry has this population of doctors out there that have very little training on the dangers of the drug that they're selling. And they're going to dismantle the previous thoughts about it and the dangers of addiction. So the pharmaceutical industry formulated a narrative that if we had a drug that was longer acting, it would be less addictive. And if we had a less addictive medication to treat pain, then we need to be treating more than just severe pain. We need to be treating everyday pain. And we're going to make pain go away, which is essentially the narrative of Purdue Pharma and the drug OxyContin. Never mind that there was no evidence that any of that stuff was true. There was no evidence that long-acting pain medications were less addictive. There was no evidence that people did better on long-term, on long-acting medications. There was absolutely nothing in the literature to support any of that. And their approach was multifaceted. They went after the FDA with the labeling. They went after pain societies and hired thought leaders and speakers and paid them big time money to hold conferences for doctors to be taught how to treat pain. And ironically, we happen to have the medication that you need to be using. And at the time, it was OxyContin, but it was far from just Purdue Pharma. The other pharmaceutical companies coattailed that for a long time, not the least of which is Mallinckrodt and multiple other pharmaceutical companies that sold drugs like Percocet and hydrocodone, Vicodin, Lortab, those type drugs, Opana, Johnson & Johnson. So it was by far not just Purdue Pharma. So now we took a drug that we knew was dangerous and we made it widely available and socially acceptable, because nothing is more widely available and socially acceptable than something that comes from a doctor's office. But what's happened over time is that we've gotten smart about this. We've realized how many people it's killing. We've realized the toll this has taken on our medical system and our criminal justice system. We've educated doctors. We've cracked down on doctors for improper prescribing, right? We're doing a much better job. We've put guidelines in place. You guys have done a great job in the state of Kentucky with actually getting some of these things codified in law so that you can prosecute pill mill doctors for harming people. And so we've made prescription pills tougher to get. What we have not done, we have not increased access to evidence-based successful treatment for opioid use disorder. And guys, whenever you're addicted to opioids, your craving for that opioids is 10 times stronger than your cravings are for food when you're hungry and water when you're thirsty. People don't just quit. First of all, they get sick. But even if they can get through the sickness, which lasts, anywhere from 1 week to 3 weeks, depending on the drug that you're taking and the route you're taking it, cravings are lifelong. And they wind up relapsing. Okay. We have to understand that. We have to understand that what drives relapse is cravings. Okay. And so now we've got this population that's addicted and they can't get the pain pills that they're addicted to. But what can they get? They can get cheap heroin. Heroin is dirt cheap compared to pain pills now. So we cut the supply, the price goes up. I'm not saying we shouldn't have cut the supply. We absolutely should have. But we should have made evidence-based treatment more widely available to the population because the iron will of the market will happen. Those prescription pain pills will be replaced by something. And at first they were replaced by heroin. So just to give you an idea, the last time I looked, and it's been several years, a pain pill in the state of Kentucky was about $1 a milligram. So if you're on 500, if you need a 40 milligram pain pill, or an 80 milligram pain pill, it's going to be about $80. And you're going to need about 3 of those to get you through the day. That's 240 milligrams. Okay. And so that's going to be $240 every day. Okay. You don't get any days off with this. How much is heroin? Heroin's dirt cheap. Heroin right now in most of the areas in Tennessee, including the rural areas, is anywhere from $8 to $12 a point. A point's a tenth of a gram. So you're going to need probably 3-4 points to get through the day. So at max, you're looking at $45 to $50 compared to $240 to $300. So it becomes a matter of economics. And you see people all the time say, well, I could never use heroin. I would never make the needle. I would never do this. I would never do that. And all those things are just not true. Because when you get desperate enough in your addiction, you will absolutely do anything to get the drug you think you have to have, or you're going to die. And that's the thing that we need to understand about addiction and how it affects our brain. So that kind of paints a picture for how we got to heroin. What's happened over the past few years is it's really, really hard to get as much heroin into the United States as you need to, right? If you had something that was more potent, more powerful, that you didn't need a field full of poppy plants to get the drug out of, that would be much better. And the answer to that is fentanyl. You don't need a field full of poppies that have to stay under the radar of the drug planes. You don't need any of that. What you need is a chemist, and fentanyl is dirt cheap. So now we're dealing with illicit fentanyl that's anywhere from 100 to 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. That transportation is not a problem. We had a drug seizure here in Tennessee a couple of years ago where they seized 6.5 grams of carfentanil. Carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent than morphine. And so I can fit 6.5 grams of carfentanil in the front pocket of my jeans. That's enough to kill half of the people in the county that I'm living in. I don't need an airplane flying in kilos. Okay. Transportation is not a problem. Fentanyl solves a lot of problems. Oh, by the way, it kills people, but no worry there because we've got an endless supply. I get people all the time saying, well, why would, if you were a drug dealer, why would you be selling something that would kill, the people that buy from you? Those are your customers. And the answer to that is that it's an endless supply. The number of people we have starting every day is outnumbering the people that are dying. And so there's always going to be a supply for these folks. And the other thing is they don't have a conscience, they're drug dealers. Okay. And so they absolutely don't care. So if you take something really cheap like fentanyl and you take how many ever grams of it and it costs you $50. And by the time you get done cutting that, On the street, it's worth about $150,000. That is a wide profit margin. And I don't think it takes much insight to look and see what would be the motivation for doing this. So if you look at everything that we talk about in terms of a slot machine, you can understand the role of genetics, you can understand the role of trauma, you can understand the role of the pharmaceutical industry, and you can start to imagine interventions that may help people with their addiction. Now, we can't do anything about genetics, but we certainly can do a lot about trauma, and we certainly can do a lot about behaviors, and we certainly can do a lot about helping people control their cravings. All right, we'll get into my favorite stuff. I love this stuff. I love the brain stuff because I always like knowing why I do the things I do. So there's two areas of the brain I want to talk about. One is the area that you see me circling right here. That's our limbic system. We're going to call it go. And then the other area of the brain I want to talk about is everything in front of this fissure right here, the frontal lobe of our brain. We're going to call it stop. So we're going to talk about stop and go real quick. So the limbic system of our brain, the go system of our brain, has two big functions. The first function is it's responsible for our will and our desire to live. How strong is your will and desire to live? What would you do to save your own life right now as we're speaking? And I'll tell you, you'll do anything. You will absolutely do anything. If you were stranded on a desert island with another person, at some point, you would look at eating that other person to save your own life. That's how strong your will and desire to live is. That is a go system function. Okay. Now, what happens in addiction is that go system is hijacked by the drug. So no longer is your goal to live. Your goal is the drug. If you don't have the drug, you can't live. And your craving for that drug is 10 times stronger than your cravings are for food when you're hungry and water when you're thirsty. So those of you who believe that people can just put this stuff down, the next time you believe that, the next time you think that, I want you to stop yourself and do like I do, because I believe the same thing, was how long can I go without eating? How long can I physically go without eating before I break down and eat? Okay. And in the outer of that's going to be about a day. At the end of a day, I'm ready to eat anything. And I have to remember that my cravings for food are 1/10 as strong as somebody's cravings are for the drug that they're addicted to, in this case, opioids. And at my point in my life, that was for sure true. The other function of the go system is it's responsible for our will and our desire to live. Our will and our desire to live, it's responsible for our will and desire to live. It's also responsible for our species going forward in time. What does our species need to go forward in time? Number one, got to live to be reproductive age. Number two, we got to have sex. Those things had better feel good or we won't do them. If every time you ate or drank, or every time you had sex, you threw up, you got sick, you would stop doing those things and our species would not go forward in time. Do eating, drinking, and sex feel good? Absolutely. So when you eat, drink, or have sex, in the go system of your brain, your body makes its own heroin, morphine, hydrocodone, oxycodone, fentanyl. They're called endorphins and enkephalins. And those endorphins and enkephalins attach to the opioid receptors, and it leads to the downstream release of a hormone called dopamine. And that makes everybody fat, happy, and satisfied. If you want to know what dopamine feels like, think about yourself 1 hour after Thanksgiving lunch. That's dopamine. Okay. And the reason is because whatever made us wants us to repeat those processes so our species can go forward in time, so they better feel good. Okay. That's go system. Stop system, frontal lobe. Okay. Stop system is insight, judgment, and empathy. So you can think about what your life would be like if you were solely driven by pleasure. If every time you had the pleasure to eat, drink, or have sex, what would your life look like? Okay. You'd weigh 700 pounds and you would be in prison. Okay, right. That's how your life would be. So we have a frontal lobe of our brain that gives us insight, judgment, and empathy. So everybody believes food, water, and sex are good things, right? And they are. Can you think of an instance where they might not be? Okay. And so the instance where they might not be, if you ever tried to lose weight. Losing weight is hard. Up until about 5 years ago, I weighed about 250. Okay. I did everything in the world I could to lose weight. I always put it back on. And then I decided I'm going to watch what I eat and exercise every day. And I did that, and I weigh about $195 today. Okay. Every morning I work out at the gym. I burn about 800 calories in an hour. On my way home, I pass a Krispy Kreme donut. All right. And I love Krispy Kreme donuts. When I pass that Krispy Kreme donut, what is the go system of my brain telling me? Pull in the Krispy Kreme, get the donuts. You know how good they are. Right now, I have just worked out for an hour. I have just burned 800 calories. I have a fully functioning stop system of my brain that says, hang on a second, Steve. Each one of those Krispy Kreme donuts are 220 calories and 20 grams of fat. You're getting ready to eat 4 of them. That's 880 calories, 80 grams of fat. What happened to my workout? I should have stayed in bed. Okay, guys, that's the interaction between the go and stop part of our brain. Our brain looks at what the possibilities are that are going to bring us pleasure. Okay, what decisions we have to make. And then the stop part of our brain gives us insight, judgment, empathy, helps us predict outcomes based on actions. And then we choose the action that gives us the biggest amount of pleasure with the least amount of consequences. That's how we make decisions all day long. That's how our brain works. Now, here's the deal. In addiction, the go and stop part of our brain, the connections between them are arrested in development at time of first drug use. How many times have you ever been sitting to talking to somebody who's 35 years old in the throes of addiction, and you're asking them questions and they're giving you answers that are making you crazy and you're getting madder by the second? Stop doing that. Getting mad doesn't work. It doesn't work. Okay. I always stop myself when I start to feeling like that. And I go, you're 35. How old were you when you started using? I was 14. So belly button age, you're dealing with a 35-year-old. Emotional insight, judgment, empathy, you're dealing with a 14-year-old. And I know how to deal with that. So remember, when somebody's in the throes of addiction, they have lost access to this stop part of their brain, and it's all about the pleasure. That's why you see people going across the street, going in a motel room, using drugs and leaving their kids in the car across the street. I'm not making an excuse for that. I'm telling you the reason, because when I understand the reason, now I can help do something about it. So let's look at this slide. This is the second most important slide I have. These are PET scans of brains. PET scans of brains just look and see where radio labeled sugar goes. All the cells in our body work on sugar in one form or another, okay? So if you had a way to attach a sugar molecule to a label that an X-ray machine could see, you stuck it in somebody, you lit them up, you could see what cells are alive and functioning. That's what a PET scan does. This is a PET scan of a normal brain. Look in the frontal lobe, uptake all throughout it, right? The frontal lobe is alive and available. The second row of brains here that have been detoxed off of drugs for 10 days. So I brought Judge Mullins in. He was using heroin. I detoxed him off of the heroin for 10 days and I set him back out on the street and said, all right, Judge, you're not going to get dope sick. Okay. So go out and don't use. And this is what Judge's brain looks like. What do you see in the frontal lobe as far as uptake goes? Absolutely nothing. What is the frontal lobe of the brain responsible for? Insight, judgment, and empathy. How long does Judge Mullins last? About the time he gets to the end of the parking lot. Okay. You go back out into your environment without treatment, you have all of the things out there that are driving you towards drug use, the drug dealer's phone number, the people you're living with, the baby daddy that's still using. And that's why you see people relapse. Now let's look at this bottom row of brains. These are bottom row brains, or brains that have been detoxed off of drugs for 100 days. Look what's starting to come back. Look at that. Starting to develop insight and judgment and empathy. They got a way better chance than they do up here. How long does it take to get from this bottom row of brains to the top row of brains? 2 years. It takes 2 years. What drives relapse? Cravings. Why does Steve Lloyd love medication so much? Because medication quells cravings. If we can quell cravings and we can keep people from relapsing and we can keep them engaged in a treatment program that helps them deal with their childhood trauma, that gives them cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, and trauma-based therapy, and helps them change their behaviors, then we have a shot at long-term recovery. And that's why I love medication. Okay, it gives us a chance at that we wouldn't otherwise have. This is Dr. Vincent Felitti. You probably don't recognize him. He's on my Mount Rushmore in medicine. He is the author of the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. He dealt with extreme morbidly obese women, mainly in Southern California in the 1980s and 1990s. What he discovered was the women would lose the weight and they would put the weight back on. He thought it had something to do with trauma. He started asking them questions about trauma from the past. Out of that was born the ACEs study. And the ACEs study tells us that when our adverse childhood experience score gets to be 4 or above, our risk of multiple diseases goes almost straight up. And those diseases are diabetes, hypertension, cancer, behavioral disorders like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, substance use disorder. There is a direct correlation between adverse childhood experiences and adverse outcomes with regards to our overall health. And Dr. Felitti was the lead author on that study. And I'm telling you about that because this is the second 7. So when we look at treatment, unless we are going to address the underlying childhood trauma or sometimes adult trauma, we can't expect to have very good outcomes with our patients. Our patients that have post-traumatic stress disorder who've been victims of physical and sexual abuse as a child and as an adult, We have to be able to address that, but we can't address it if they're already dead. We can use medication to keep people alive long enough to step into this meaningful therapy. That's all second seven stuff. I encourage you to explore ACEs even more. To me, it's the second most important study ever done in the history of medicine outside of hand washing. And this is the third seven. This is a part of my talk where I usually make people very angry. When Purdue Pharma was promoting the drug OxyContin, and if you've seen any of the Hulu series Dope Sick, this plays prominently in the series Dope Sick, is that they said studies in the New England Journal of Medicine show that these medications are less than 1% addictive, but nobody bothered to look up the study. And what you have on the screen in front of you there is this study. And the first thing you realize, it's not a study, it's a letter to the editor, right? To the editor, just like you would write to your newspaper, written by a guy named Herschel Jick and his graduate student, Dr. Jane Porter, who said, we've got about 40,000 people in our hospital. About 11,800 of them got a narcotic while they were here. We followed them when they got out, and only 2 of them became addicted. Well, this is not only not a study, it's not even comparing apples to apples. This is short-term use of a medication in the hospital compared to outpatient use on a daily basis for months and years on end. Purdue Pharma knew that this was crap. And when you see them losing their lawsuits and going bankrupt and spending the money that they're having to spend right now, which, by the way, is not near enough to get us where we need to be, this is the reason. They knew that the rate of addiction was about 15 to 20% and not the less than 1% that they were promoting, and certainly not less than the short-acting agents that the FDA somehow thought was appropriate to put in their package insert from the administration that was supposed to be overlooking the situation and not allowing drug companies to mispromote their drug. This letter, this 100 words, have killed more people in the United States than any other 100 words that I can think of off the top of my head. So I think if you look at it now, you can understand the role of genetics, the role of trauma, and the role of social opportunity. And those are my 3 sevens. Now let's look at medications used to treat opioid addiction. We've got several. The base compound buprenorphine, it's sold either as buprenorphine or with an abuse deterrent called naloxone. Those are the generic names. The trade names are names that we'll recognize. So buprenorphine by itself, without the naloxone, which is the abuse deterrent, are sold under the names of Probufene or Sublocade, which is an injection into the belly once a month. It's also sold under the trade name of Subutex. Buprenorphine plus naloxone is put in it as an abuse deterrent. So if you shoot it or you snort it, then the naloxone blocks the opioid receptor and the buprenorphine can't take effect. Okay, so that's why it's in there. It's sold under the trade name of Suboxone, Zubsolv, and Bunavail. Okay, so I'm trying to get you familiar with the names. Another medication used to treat opioid addiction is methadone. Methadone can only be prescribed and dispensed in special clinics throughout the United States that are highly regulated. You have to go to the clinic every day for long periods of time before you get even one day of take home. Methadone clinics are regulated by both the DEA federally and by state government. And last but not least, injection in medication-wise is a drug known as naltrexone, extended release naltrexone, and it's sold under the trade name of Vivitrol. So each of these medications has pluses and minuses. There's no perfect medication. All of them quell cravings. And remember, I told you, people don't relapse because of withdrawal symptoms. They relapse because of cravings. Naltrexone is an excellent drug. I love naltrexone. It's injectable. It goes in your backside once every 30 days. It is an opioid blocker. It is not an opioid itself. For the patients that it works for, it works really, really well. And it does quell cravings. It does nothing for withdrawal symptoms. So the downside to Vivitrol is that you have to have somebody completely off the drug for a period of time before you can give it to them. Okay, and a lot of times that becomes a downside in the fact that you can't keep them off of something long enough to be able to give them the drug. It's a monthly injection, so compliance is a really good thing. Naltrexone works best in systems where you have leverage, okay? And the criminal justice system is somewhere that you have leverage. Now, let's take a look at the criminal justice system historically. Historically, the CJA system has looked down on methadone and buprenorphine, Suboxone. So you're trading one drug for another. This drug is diverted, and that is true. That is true. Both of those drugs can be diverted. but the diversion rate is about 15 to 18%. That means that 80 to 82% of the people, or sorry, 82 to 85% of the people are not diverting it. Okay. And so the benefit outweighs the risk. And I am not okay with diversion. I'm just telling you the reality. And the studies that showed that were actually out of the University of Kentucky in Lexington. Naltrexone, naltrexone is not an opioid. It has no abuse potential. It is not diverted. It has plenty of selling points. But the company that makes naltrexone, Alkermes, targeted the criminal justice system, because they knew that jails, drug courts, and prisons had traditionally opposed methadone and buprenorphine. So their main selling point is it's not an opioid. And that's a good thing that it's not an opioid. But we need to know, does it keep our patients alive, and does it hold them in the treatment process? And there's way less evidence for Vivitrol in those two things than there are for methadone and buprenorphine. And I use Vivitrol. I use it for the patients it works well in. It works well. I have trouble whenever I have patients that are injecting more than a half a gram to a gram of heroin or fentanyl per day. I have trouble when I don't have leverage so that they have to come back and get the next injection. Vivitrol patients have a higher, naltrexone patients have a higher dropout rate after initiation than buprenorphine or methadone. And this treatment process is all about keeping people engaged, right? We've got to get them down the road to that 1 and 2 year mark so the frontal lobe of their brain can come back online, and we can start to engage in these treatments to address the underlying trauma and cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a smaller evidence base than either buprenorphine or methadone. And what that means is our track record with it is shorter. We don't know as much about it long term. We do know that it has never been shown to have a mortality benefit. The other two drugs have a mortality benefit. What does that mean? That means that patients live that would have otherwise died. That has not been shown with Vivitrol. And a recent study showed that buprenorphine, Suboxone, is more protective against overdose than extended release naltrexone. I am not a naltrexone naysayer, not at all. If I have patients that are suited for abstinence-based therapy, who have systems that they're going to go into that's going to support their recovery, I have leverage, and they have not failed that form of treatment before, then I'm all about it, and it is an excellent drug. But don't just listen to the positive for the drug company. There are plenty of downsides to go along with this drug. The next drug is methadone. Methadone probably causes everybody in the room's hair to stand up on the back of their neck. And I can tell you that it saves lives. Used in a part of a comprehensive treatment program, methadone has a mortality benefit approaching 70%. We will do things in medicine that have a mortality benefit of 7%, let alone 70%. Methadone has to be dispensed. Most of the time it's in a liquid like you see in front of you at a special clinic that has a DEA registration and is also regulated by the state. It is a full opioid. It is just like heroin. It is just like morphine. It is just like oxycodone. It is just like hydrocodone, only it's really long acting. And patients don't build tolerance to it like they do the other drugs. And because of those two things, it becomes an effective treatment for opioid use disorder. It increases people's retention and treatment. And if you look at areas where methadone clinics, good methadone clinics are in operation, it decreases the death rate. It keeps people from dying. I love medication because it saves people's lives. I don't know how to treat dead people. I've never figured that out. The first thing I got to do is keep them alive. And now I can go on and do the other things that we need to do to help them with behavioral change. It decreases crime. Every time this has been looked at, areas where methadone clinics have, when we have a methadone clinic come into the area, crime goes down. We get people out of those addictive behaviors. We start to get them feeling a little better. They start to get some things in their life, like a job and have money, and they want to keep those things. Methadone is a really good thing. And this is the most heavily restricted FDA approved medication in the United States. So people say, oh, it's diverted, it's that. This is the most heavily restricted medication in the United States. And most of the methadone that you see on the street is not coming out of methadone clinics. It's coming out of pain clinics in pill form, and we need to be addressing that for sure. And last but not least, we have buprenorphine. You all know it's Suboxone. It comes in two forms. It comes in a film, which is in this container, or it comes in a pill. It's placed under the tongue and absorbed that way. You do not swallow it. How can people abuse it? They can abuse it by injecting it. They can abuse it by snorting it. People who are doing that would much prefer Subutex because it's just buprenorphine and it doesn't have the blocker in it. So when you see people wanting Subutex, a lot of times it's going to be because they're actually using it illicitly in their vein or up their nose. They don't want the blocker. Anytime I see somebody who comes in and can't take anything but Subutex, that is a red flag for me, and diversion and misuse. Buprenorphine is a partial opioid agonist. It controls cravings and withdrawals. That means it acts at the opioid receptor, but it doesn't give you the full oomph, okay? It acts only up to a certain level. It has what's called a ceiling effect. That means it attaches to that opioid receptor. It keeps your withdrawals down. It keeps your cravings down, but the more of it you take, you don't get high. And by the way it interacts with those receptors, it quells your cravings while not letting you overdose. Okay, so people overdosing on buprenorphine is almost unheard of. Matter of fact, the only time that I ever have seen it is when they mix it with something like alcohol or benzodiazepines like Valium or Xanax. There is a low likelihood of respiratory depression. You have to remember that people die of opioid overdoses, they stop breathing. Buprenorphine has a really, really low likelihood of that because at the receptor that's responsible for respiratory depression, it's actually a blocker. It has more affinity for the opioid receptor for it to react. It has more affinity so it will actually go in and displace other drugs if they're present. So if you had somebody that had overdosed on heroin and you had Suboxone laying around, you could actually reverse that overdose with Suboxone, right? Because the Suboxone has more affinity for that receptor than the opioid does, and it doesn't give you a full effect at that receptor. So the patients are less likely to feel high from using buprenorphine. France approved buprenorphine for the treatment of opioid use disorder in the 1990s, and their overdose deaths fell by 80%. The more widely available we make drugs like methadone and buprenorphine, the more impact that we're going to have on overdose deaths. The more people we keep alive, the more people we can engage in the treatment process with things like cognitive behavioral therapy. So I told you this talk was aggressive. I'm going to try to cover the three big forms of therapy that we leave. So what is cognitive behavioral therapy? So this is a one-on-one interaction with somebody suffering from opioid use disorder and a counselor that's trained in CBT. And what CBT does, or cognitive behavioral does, it tracks their thoughts and linked feelings. And it helps people look at the circumstances they're in and the feelings they're having around those circumstances, i.e. triggers, and how to deal with those circumstances without reaching for the drug. That's the long and short of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it takes a long time. You can't do this in a week. Cognitive behavioral therapy is ongoing. It also helps patients identify patterns. So if we got any smokers in the audience, you're definitely going to recognize this. If you're a smoker, the half-life of nicotine is only 4 hours. That means to get through a regular 16-hour day, just from a purely physical standpoint, you only need 4 cigarettes. How many of you that smoke only smoke 4 cigarettes a day? Almost none of you. Most of you smoke a pack a day. That's 20 cigarettes. You're smoking 16 cigarettes a day just because of the patterns of things around you. Oh, I get done with the meal, I'm gonna have a cigarette. Oh, I've got to go listen to my mother-in-law, I need a cigarette. Oh, I've got to deal with this with my wife and kids when I get home, I need a cigarette. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps people recognize their behaviors around substance use and then helps them to learn healthy coping skills around that. That's as simple as I can make it, and it's really a beautiful thing. Cognitive behavioral therapy helped save my life. What about contingency management? Contingency management, I want you to think of like this, and my guess is you do it in your recovery court. My guess is that when you have people doing well, you have little things that you give them. In our court, it's candy bars. The big rewards are like gas cards for the kids when they're doing well in court, because no kid should have to come to court. It's ice cream cones. Those are all contingency management. So if you think about the rewards of recovery, where do they happen? They happen a year down the road. They happen 2 years down the road. And we don't want to wait that long for our rewards. So what contingency management does is build smaller rewards while we're waiting on the bigger rewards. And the weird thing is that people will be compliant in recovery programs for as little as a $5 Walmart gift card. It's absolutely amazing. This all came out of Skinner's operant conditioning. You may not recognize that, but you certainly recognize the rat that rings the bell and gets fed. The rat that rings the bell and gets fed, right? And so what you're doing is you're rewarding that behavior of ringing the bell. So you soon learn that if you want the reward, then you've got to do the behavior. It involves positive reinforcements to help people change behavior. It's been applied to alcoholism as far back as the 1960s. We started using it in drug treatment in 1970s, and contingency management is the most effective treatment for methamphetamine use disorder. And last but not least is trauma therapy. Those patients like Steve Lloyd who experienced severe childhood trauma with physical and sexual abuse, helping people deal with that trauma. We can't change the past, but we can help people experience the past in a non-threatening way through something called EMDR. And I encourage you to look that up. It's done by trained folks in the therapy world. It's a number of sessions where we help unlock these suppressed memories in the brain, help you relive them without the physiologic reaction. So when I talk to you about my physical abuse, or I talk to you about my sexual abuse as a child, I don't have those same reactions that I need to medicate anymore. They still happen, but I don't have the physiologic response because of the therapy that I received. And if we look at people who've experienced trauma, they're 15 times more likely to commit suicide. They're 2.5 more times likely to smoke. Guys, these are all self-medication. They're 4 times more likely to have unhealthy use of alcohol. They're 4 times more likely to inject drugs. They're 3 times more likely to have issues with behavioral health. So until we start talking about addressing these underlying drivers of addiction, such as trauma, I don't think that we're going to get where we all want to be. And with prevention, identifying those kids are at risk that are already experiencing these traumas and haven't picked up the drug yet, I think that's where the rubber meets the road in prevention. As we wind down, if you want to be worried about something, I will tell you right now on your screen something to be worried about. This looks like a Percocet, looks like a 10 milligram oxycodone, but it's not. This was bought in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is about 35 miles south of where I'm currently sitting. Oxycodone is 1.5 morphine equivalents. That means that a 10 milligram oxycodone or Percocet is 15 morphine equivalents. Only this is not oxycodone. This is carfentanil. Carfentanil is 10,000 morphine equivalents. The long and short of it is you take this 10 milligram, what you think is oxycodone, you're taking 10,000 milliequivalents of morphine and you die. The drug overdose deaths that we see now are mainly secondary to illicit fentanyl that's adulterated in heroin, that's pressed into pills that look just like what our folks are getting out of the pharmacy. Now, this one has some impurities in it that you can see if you look close. But I can tell you, I've seen pill presses that I can't tell the difference. And I promise you, I have a PhD in oxycodone and hydrocodone. This is what's killing Tennesseans. This is what's killing Kentuckians. This is what's killing Americans. But we don't need to ease up on the prescription drugs, because you got to remember, 80% of the people who are using illicit heroin and fentanyl got their start with prescribed pain medication. And now to my last slide, and the most important slide that I have. And I know Judge Mullins and I have talked enough to know, I know he believes this. This is what we're all here for. This is the reason we do what we do. It's the reason that gets me up every morning. I don't have any hobbies. I don't play golf. I don't fish. I don't do any of that stuff. I do addiction. When I go home tonight, my recreation will be reading a book I'm reading right now called The Opioid Fix. That's what I do. This is my family. This is my son, Heath. This is my now daughter-in-law, Laura. This is my wife, Karen. That's me. I had a little bit more hair then than I do right now. And usually I wear a hat, but out of respect for the court, I got rid of the hat because I would never want to disrespect the court. And I'm not having to look at my bald head in this Zoom call, so it's made it easier on me. This is where I want to spend my time with this last slide. This is where all my money goes. This is my daughter, Haley. And the dads in this room today that have little girls know what I'm getting ready to say is true. When you have a little girl, you know at some point somebody's going to come along and take her away. It's going to happen. And I knew that Haley's entire life. And I made sure every morning of her life, I went in, I kissed her on the head before I went to work, and I told her how much she belonged and how much she mattered. In the back of my mind, knowing one of these days it was going to happen. Well, when she was a junior in high school, she brought this thing right here home. They were going to the senior prom. He was a senior and she was a junior. It was their first date. She was inside getting ready because she's never been on time a day in her life. And so I'm out on the front porch of my house and I'm going to try to scare this thing away. And I talked to this kid, his name's Sterling, for about 5 minutes. I walked inside. My wife was in the kitchen making dinner. And I said, "Hey, Karen, I think I just met our son-in-law." And she was like, oh, come on, Steve. She said, they're juniors and seniors in high school. It's their first date. Sure enough, several years later, I'm standing at the end of a long aisle that's got a preacher and a Bible on the other end of it. And you all know what that is. And I've got Haley on my right arm. And I'm dying. I can't believe I'm in this moment. I can't believe it got here that quick. And right before we walked down the aisle, Haley, she's on my arm. She lays her head over on my shoulder. And she said, Daddy, you're the first man I ever loved. Thank you for everything you ever did for me. And guys, at that moment, that day got really good in a hurry, right? That's a moment that we all look for. That's a moment that this is why we get up and go to work in the morning. So when we're dealing with people that have substance use disorder that are in our courts, I want us to remember that everybody wants this picture. The truth is that most of the people in the court, the closest thing that they've ever had to a mother or father are you guys. You're the closest thing they've ever had. Closest thing to a dad they've ever had is judge. And I see it all the time. And I want us to never lose sight of that. How many chances does somebody get? Many's in need. There's going to be consequences and there's going to be things that happen. I mean, many chances they need. The only way that they don't get another chance is they're dead. I want them to have moments like that. Now, at that moment, my gratitude was really high, but I knew in the back of my mind, my gratitude was even higher. And my family doesn't know this part of the story. In the programs that we gave our guests that night, I was in there as Stephen Lloyd, father of the bride. I was not in there as Stephen Lloyd, parentheses. You all know what's in parentheses, right? Birth and death dates are in parentheses. I'm still a dash. I'm Stephen Lloyd, May 11th, 1967 dash. I'm still alive today, the 29th of March, 2022. Y'all will see this later. I'm still a dash. I was able to be in that moment with my daughter. My husband, my son was not giving her away. Karen hadn't remarried. Her stepdad wasn't giving her away. It was her father. And her father was there to walk down the aisle with her because somebody met me where I was and helped me into recovery by whatever path was needed. That's what happened with me. Now, I hated it when Heath left home, but it was a lot easier than her leaving home. But during the pandemic, and the pandemic did a few good things. One thing was it brought back the evening dinner table. And so no sports on TV. We're having dinner together. Heath walks in March in 2020. He's getting married in October. He sits down, he looks over at me and he said, hey, Pops, he said, would you be the best man at my wedding? The two biggest honors I ever had in my life was standing beside my son the day he married Laura and walking my daughter down the aisle. And I got to do those things because I didn't die in 2004. I got into recovery. I want us all to keep that story in the back of our minds. This is what we all want. Let's put our stigma, our prides, and our prejudices over to the side, and let's try our level best to help people find the path to recovery that's right for them. I enjoyed my time with you. I'll be available during the question and answer session in live to answer any questions that you might have. And I hope that you guys have a great remainder of your day. Thank you.